This is a reading from Modern Saints by Anne Ball. 16. St. John Bosco. John Melchior Bosco, born 1815, died 1888 in Italy at the age of 72. A story is told about two of Don Bosco's friends who were worried about his sanity. He had spoken with such confidence of the things he had seen in his dreams that they were afraid he was losing his mind. They asked him to take a ride in their carriage, planning to trick him into seeing a doctor to check his mental stability. Don Bosco readily accepted the offer of a drive in the country. When the coach drew up at the door, he politely insisted that the other two get in first, while he held the door. Instead of climbing after them, he slammed the door shut and called to the coachman, "To the lunatic asylum, quick!" The coachman set off at a lively pace. It was only with the greatest difficulty that the two clerics persuaded the doctors at the asylum that the wrong persons had been brought. After this incident, they did not badger Don Bosco about his dreams again. Throughout his life, Father Bosco, or Don Bosco, was guided by these strangely vivid dreams. Through them, he learned what to do about his life's work: boys. He founded an order dedicated to helping the poor boys of Italy, and later boys all over the world. In addition to his dreams, so many miraculous occurrences happened to and around Don Bosco that Pope Pius XI said of his life, "The supernatural almost became natural, and the extraordinary ordinary." Through Don Bosco's blessing, many people were cured of dread diseases. He had the gift of prophecy and could read hearts. In addition, his sanctity seemed to encourage sanctity in others. Several of the candidates for canonization in this book, as well as two canonized saints treated herein, were directly influenced by Don Bosco. When he was growing up, John Bosco worked hard on the family farm at the foot of the Italian Alps. The greatest influence on him was his devout mother, Margherita Bosco. Later in life, she came to help in the care of his students. Margherita made many sacrifices for her children, including allowing John to go to school in Castelnuovo at the age of 9 and board with a good family she knew. After school, he worked at odd jobs to support himself and send some money to his mother and the two brothers left at home. John had an excellent sense of humor and more than once played tricks on his unsuspecting friends. At one house where he boarded while attending school, he played so many tricks on his host that the poor man began to suspect that John was in cahoots with the devil and complained to a local canon. The canon called John in to answer the charges. Very politely, John asked the canon the time. When the man felt for his watch, he found that it had disappeared, along with his purse. When John explained where the items had gone and how he had done the tricks, the interview ended with much laughter. As a child, John Bosco learned to be an expert juggler and acrobat. He put on little shows for the children and adults of the neighborhood. In payment for his performance, John asked his audience to say a few prayers with him or to attend Mass. Later, when he was a priest, one of Don Bosco's favorite maxims was, "Enjoy yourself as much as you like, if only you keep from sin." Once during a mission, John and some friends found a professional juggler setting up his stall outside the church. He planned to perform during Mass. John challenged him to a wager on a test of skill and won. Rather than take the man's money, John asked him to promise not to perform until the Mass was over. After a vision of our Lord and Our Lady when he was 9, John had determined to become a priest to fulfill the vocation they had shown him, a vocation of love and help for poor street boys. Although he started his studies late, John was so diligent that he completed the necessary work and was ordained in 1841 at the age of 26. At this time in Italy, there was no protection for juveniles. Boys of 12 and 13 were often sentenced to prison for small breaches of the law. Once in prison, there was seldom hope for them to be out again for long, as they seemed to get into trouble again and again. Don Bosco believed that these boys would not be where they were if they had someone to love and care for them. Child labor was prevalent all over Europe, and from the age of about 7 on up, young boys were sent to work in the factories. These boys worked long, hard hours and were not allowed to spend a carefree childhood. After work, the boys might stop in the local cafe for a glass of wine, if they had the money. Some of these boys had homes, but many were orphans who slept in empty houses or on the streets. Some came from large families, and others worked to support widowed mothers or disabled fathers. One thing they all had in common: they were poor. One night, Don Bosco discovered the sexton of his church scolding a young boy who had crept into the sacristy for warmth. "You don't know how to serve Mass. Then what are you doing here? Leave at once. Don Bosco called the boy back and talked to him kindly. He offered to teach the boy his prayers and invited him to come back the next Sunday with his friends. The boy showed up the next week with 4 other ragged street boys. All looked as if they needed a meal. Don Bosco recognized in these children the boys Our Lady had shown him in his vision, and soon there was a group of 30 boys coming to talk to the friendly priest. The group became known as the Oratory, and it grew so large that it had to meet in the country because the neighbors began to complain about the noisy games. Don Bosco recognized the need for a permanent place for his boys. He realized that some of them had no homes and needed food and shelter. He rented a house and brought his mother to help care for the little group. Besides feeding and clothing them, Don Bosco helped the boys to find jobs, taught them catechism, and began night school to teach them to read and write. Later, he began trade school to teach them a good and honest way to make a living. Don Bosco's motto was, give me souls, take away the rest. He told the boys of the Oratory to do 3 things to stay on the path to heaven. Go to confession regularly, receive communion often, and choose a regular confessor to whom you can unburden your heart. Don Bosco sometimes saw in dreams the state of soul of boys at the Oratory. In one dream, he saw some of them shining with light and looking so handsome that they no longer seemed to be his boys. He saw others with eyes, ears, and tongue covered with sores, their mouths filled with dirt, giving off a foul odor, and their bodies a deathly color. Others appeared in the dream with their hearts eaten through with maggots or filled with snakes, that is, mortal sins. Don Bosco was in agony over their terrible state and longed to bring them back to spiritual health. Don Bosco described this dream to the boys without mentioning specific names and urged them to examine their consciences and cleanse their souls in confession. He was bombarded with questions, but he answered, come to my room one by one, and I'll answer your questions. All day long, boys visited Don Bosco to speak of their souls. One boy later related that Don Bosco knew, without being told, of a sin he had withheld in confession to another priest. When Don Bosco brought it up, the boy began to weep, but then literally ran back to make a sincere confession. In his dream, Don Bosco had also seen hearts filled with flowers or virtues, and most of the boys jumped with joy when Don Bosco told them of the rewards of a good life. In another dream, Don Bosco saw 3 boys on whose shoulders sat ugly monkeys with long, sharp claws. These were sinners against purity, and the monkeys kept them from confession. Don Bosco told the assembled boys of this dream and promised to tell more to anyone in private. To many who presented themselves, he answered, no, it's not you. But he was frank with the 3 when he did speak with them. One of these later admitted that Don Bosco had truly seen the state of his soul. Don Bosco was poor all of his life. Often there was no money to pay the rent or the workmen on the churches which he built. He placed his entire trust in God, and God took care of this remarkable man. Before his death, he had spent millions on his boys, building large schools, a basilica to Our Lady in Turin, and one to the Sacred Heart in Rome, and financing mission expeditions. Whenever he was directed to work through one of his dreams, he began it immediately, whether or not funds to finance it were available. God always provided. At one time, an intensely anti-Catholic group known as the Waldensians made several attempts on Don Bosco's life. He was shot at more than once, and often on his travels through the city of Turin late at night after hearing a dying person's confession. Ruffians would set upon him to beat him up. Mysteriously, a large grey hound dog that Don Bosco called Grigio would appear to make his rounds with him and protect him from attackers. Although the dog was several times seen returning home with him, it never stayed around, disappearing as silently and mysteriously as it had appeared. Miracles, small and large, were everyday occurrences around the saintly priest. Once, when Don Bosco was halfway through saying Mass, the sexton realized that he had forgotten to put the extra ciborium in place for the consecration. A large crowd was there, and the sexton was worried about how unhappy the priest would be when he ran out of hosts. Don Bosco's dismay was evident as he looked at the small number of hosts in the ciborium. With a quick prayer to heaven, he began to distribute communion. When he had given communion to the large crowd, he returned to the altar. There was still 1 host left, as well as a greatly astonished sexton. Italy at this time was unsuited to the formation of any new religious order. Those already in existence were being harassed and sometimes disbanded by the anti-clerical government. Yet, it was a liberal politician who suggested the idea of a new congregation to Don Bosco. When the saint smilingly told the man that he felt it would be foolish to start a new order, only to have the politician immediately suppress it, the man said, "No, you work for the poor. No one will resent what you do. We will not touch you." Guided by Our Lady, Don Bosco looked first to his own students in forming his new order. In 1859, the Congregation of St. Francis de Sales, the Salesians, was born, and it received papal approval by 1869. In 1875, after seeing a vision of starving, unwashed, poorly clothed girls who pleaded for help, Don Bosco and St. Mary Mazzarello founded the Salesian Sisters, whom Don Bosco called the Daughters of Mary, Help of Christians. The third part of his religious family was a group of lay people known as Salesian Cooperators. The Cooperators pledged themselves to work with and help the Salesian priests, brothers, and sisters in the salvation of young people. These all use the preventive system, working to help boys and girls learn to be good before they get into trouble. In one vision, Don Bosco saw a horde of savages who were massacring some white men. A group of missionaries dressed as Salesians came through the jungle, and the savages dropped their weapons and bent their heads in prayer. This vision became a reality when in 1875, at the request of Argentina and the Holy See, the first Salesian missionaries left for South America. Soon, their missions extended throughout the Latin world. "First, tell the devil to rest, and then I'll rest too," Don Bosco used to reply to those who urged him later in life to slow down in his vigorous activity. Toward the end of his life, he was afflicted with the loss of vision in one eye, a weak back, and painfully swollen legs. Still, he would not rest. "While I have time, I must work." One special helper of Don Bosco was Dominic Savio, a former pupil. Dominic died at the age of 15 after promising to send help from heaven. In 1876, Don Bosco had a dream in which he saw Dominic in glory, and indeed, Dominic was declared a saint in 1954. Happily, Don Bosco was able to live to see the spread and early growth of his congregation, which is now one of the largest orders in the world. The man who lived poor also died poor. On the day of his death in 1888, his fellow religious were obliged to beg the baker for bread on credit. Pope Pius XI said of Don Bosco, "God gave him magnanimity of heart as the sand on the seashore." Don Bosco was beatified in 1929 to the great joy of a large and tumultuously happy crowd. He was canonized just a few years later on Easter Sunday of 1934. I'll read the caption before I show you the picture. Upper. As a boy, St. John Bosco often entertained people with his acrobatic feats. As payment for the show, John would ask his audience to say a few prayers with him or to attend Mass. And lower, St. John Bosco grew up on a farm at the foot of the Italian Alps. So in the upper panel, you can see him about to walk across a tightrope in front of some onlookers. And then on the bottom page, you see him on some kind of farm surrounded by animals. Left. Don Father Bosco's motto was, "Give me souls, take away the rest." He laid great stress on the sacrament of confession as a means to holiness. Here Don Bosco is shown hearing the confession of Paul Albera, who later became the third superior of the Salesians. Right. Don Bosco wanted the boys of the oratory to be saints, happy saints, not long-faced saints. In addition to his prophetic dreams, so many miraculous occurrences happened to and around Don Bosco that Pope Pius XI said of his life, "The supernatural almost became natural, and the extraordinary ordinary." This unretouched photograph of St. John Bosco shows the stubble of his beard, which he rarely found time to shave adequately. left. Mama Margarita, John Bosco's mother, was a strong influence in his life and a great help in his work as a priest. She became the mother of his homeless boys, though she almost packed up and went home on one occasion when the boys had been causing more trouble than she could bear. This picture is probably taken from a painted miniature. Right. Don Bosco was a feeble old man toward the end of his life. Behind him is his former student and successor, Blessed Michael Rua.